We're going to keep moving through the presidents here. We're going to talk first. Well, we're going to talk about the presidents of the 70s and 80s, and we're going to start here with Richard Nixon, who became president in the election of 1968. When we learn about Nixon, and later when we learn about Bill Clinton, we're going to see how political parties change their opinions on issues over time. Because what we're going to look at under Nixon, we're going to see a lot of the policies passed, and there are going to be a lot of policies that we would not really associate with the Republican Party of today. And when we look at Bill Clinton later, we will see a lot of, even though Bill Clinton is a Democrat, we'll see a lot of positions that he took that don't really look like they would be positions of the Democratic Party today. The parties can change over time. The party's ideas on things change over time, and Nixon is a great example of that. So let's take a look at some of his domestic and foreign policy achievements. In domestic policy, Nixon really got a lot done. Some of the things we talked about earlier in this class, way back in Chapter 3, Nixon is one of the driving ideas behind what we called New Federalism. He liked the devolution of power, so he took his opportunity as president to return some lawmaking powers back to the states. That would have been one of the important things that Nixon wanted to change about the national government. But he also allowed the national government to grow in a lot of ways. Nixon is partially responsible for the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. In the early 1970s, the people were starting to take notice of all the ways that human activity was being harmful to the environment, and Nixon, with the cooperation of Congress, created an agency that would oversee the protection of the environment in the United States. Nixon also used his power as president to declare what he called the war on cancer. Now, this is important because this is going to be a thing that other presidents start to do. They like this idea of war because in war, the people really come together and work against a common enemy. And so here's where presidents start declaring war on things other than other countries. So we'll see like a war on drugs, a war on terror, and things like that. But here Nixon wanted to put the full strength of the United States government on against fighting cancer and getting all of the people behind fighting cancer. So this would be an example of the government supporting the sciences, right? He's putting the full strength of the government together on this effort to fight against cancer and hopefully, find a cure for cancer. Nixon was also a promoter of the Equal Rights Amendment, something we learned about back in Chapter 2. The Equal Rights Amendment would have been added to the Constitution. It was passed by Congress. It would have guaranteed that there was no discrimination against women under the law, but it was not ratified by enough states. So here Nixon and Congress both thought that this was worthy of being added to the Constitution, but the state governments did not want it added to the Constitution, so it did not end up happening. Now, what you're mostly familiar with Nixon for probably is the Watergate scandal. This was a scandal where his campaign was spying on his opponent's campaign in the election of 1972. Nixon was caught participating in this and participating in a cover-up, and he resigned before he would have been impeached. So Nixon would have been impeached in 1974. There were enough votes from Republicans and Democrats that he would have most likely been removed from office, and so Nixon resigned as president instead of face impeachment from Congress. In foreign policy, Nixon took over a lot of the foreign policy situations inherited from LBJ, and he's president in the middle of the Cold War, so he continues a lot of the same policies here. He has to deal with the Vietnam War. Now, what Nixon was able to do was to a process he called Vietnamization. He was trying to transfer the responsibility from the war from the United States back to the people of South Vietnam. Ultimately, Nixon was able to negotiate a peace between North and South Vietnam and end to the war without any war objectives complete. Nixon is also the first president of the United States to visit China. This is incredibly important because this is an example of the president using their power of diplomatic recognition. China was a communist government at the time. It still is, but the Communist Party of China is in charge of China, and the United States government had refused to recognize that group as being in charge of China for about 20 years. So the United States from 1949 to this visit in the 1970s had refused to deal with the real leaders of China. But Nixon finally recognized diplomatically the communist government of China and began a normal relationship between China and the United States. Nixon also worked on treaties to reduce arms between the United States and the Soviet Union, something started under Lyndon Johnson, but continued under Nixon. And like we mentioned earlier, when presidents have a doctrine, a philosophy of foreign policy, Nixon also had a doctrine, and his doctrine was that the United States would play less of a combat role around the world, but would find other ways to give assistance to our allies. So we would do things like arms sales and other ways of supporting governments around the world with not necessarily using American troops. After Nixon resigns, we have the short presidency of Gerald Ford. Here's Gerald Ford sitting at his desk. Gerald Ford is the only president of the United States to have not been elected in any way. He was not Nixon's original vice president. He was actually chosen as a replacement vice president after Nixon's original vice president had to resign. So Ford was never actually involved in a U.S. presidential election before he was put into office. But he was president for a short amount of time following the resignation of Richard Nixon. We're not going to have to worry a whole lot about Gerald Ford. His domestic policy, big achievements here. One of the things he did first as president, he took over for Richard Nixon after Richard Nixon resigned because of a scandal. And one of the first things he did was he pardoned Richard Nixon so that Richard Nixon would not face punishment for any of his crimes. Now, this is a really important example of the president using their pardon power. You can use the pardon power to forgive anyone for anything, even in this case, involvement in cheating in an election and a cover-up scandal. But this was really unpopular with the American public. The American public was very upset about Richard Nixon. They wanted to see Richard Nixon punished. So Gerald Ford thought that this would be an important way for America to move past the Watergate scandal, but it ended up becoming very unpopular and probably one of the reasons why he was not reelected. So the president has pardon power. We've also mentioned how the president has amnesty power. Gerald Ford granted amnesty to Vietnam draft dodgers. So instead of an individual pardon, this is a pardon for a whole group of lawbreakers. This does not have to pardon each lawbreaker individually. But in this case, Gerald Ford granted amnesty, and it forgave all American citizens who have committed the crime of dodging the draft during the Vietnam War. All of them were forgiven from punishment. Ford also pushed for the Equal Rights Amendment following Richard Nixon, so he was also promoting this and trying to get this ratified by the states, but not enough states agreed that this was something that should have been added to the Constitution. Foreign policy-wise, there's not a lot going on with Gerald Ford. He was really trying to focus on getting America back to normal after the big Watergate scandal. During his presidency, this was what happened. The fall of Saigon took place in Vietnam, so this was the capital of South Vietnam. So South Vietnam officially fell under the control of the communist North Vietnam while Gerald Ford was in charge. So this was very symbolic as an example of the United States being unsuccessful in its goal of protecting South Vietnam in the Vietnam War. So this was a real low point in American politics, and Gerald Ford had a lot of problems to deal with that he was not necessarily very successful in dealing with in terms of getting the support of the American people. All right, after Nixon and his vice president Ford, Americans were ready for a change. They elected Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, a small southern peanut farmer who was governor. He was elected very much a different president for the United States, and there's a short period of time where he's president and tries to change things quite a bit. Here we see him at his most successful moment negotiating peace between Egypt and Israel, for which he won the Nobel Prize for accomplishing this. But let's look at his domestic and foreign policy achievements. Now, Carter, he's a Democrat. He's running pretty soon after the Watergate scandal. America's still upset about the Watergate scandal and still upset with the president. Carter wanted to prove that he was different than the presidents that we had been dealing with, so he was determined in his campaign to show America that he was a Washington outsider. He wanted to prove to American voters that he was different. Now, a lot of people campaign that way, but when they get into Washington, they tend to do things like all the other presidents, and Jimmy Carter really didn't take this approach. So he tried to keep his Washington outsider status when he became president, and he actually refused to cooperate with Congress. And so this is not a strategy that successful presidents would use. Successful presidents need to cooperate with Congress in order to get a lot done. Think back to Lyndon Johnson. He got a lot done because he was so good at cooperating with Congress. And here, Jimmy Carter refused to cooperate with Congress. One of the many reasons why he's going to end up with only one term as president. Now, while he's president, there's a big oil crisis in the United States due to situations around the world. There's actually oil shortages here in the United States. People are waiting in line for gas for hours. And Jimmy Carter, one of the things he does is he puts price controls on oil. He limits the price of oil so that gas station owners could not charge crazy amounts of money for the limited oil supply that they had. So this is a new power of the president to put controls, to put limits on the prices of goods. So that means presidents could do this in times of emergency. There are all sorts of big economic problems here in the late 70s. There's a lot of economic stagnation. Unemployment is really bad. And if a president the president does not have a lot of control over the economy, but the president is going to get blamed when the economy is bad. They really don't have a lot that they can do to fix things. Anything that the president does to try to help the economy usually happens very slowly, but when there are economic problems, they get blamed, and this is definitely true of Carter. So there were a lot of economic problems outside of his control while he was president, and he took the blame for those and was unable to fix those quickly for Americans. But also important from Jimmy Carter, he's the first president to meet with gay rights advocates in the United States. So he was the first president to decide that that was a worthy cause, and that advocates for gay rights should be able to meet with the president and have their voices heard and have a little bit of input on the types of policies that would protect their rights and things like that. So these are the domestic policy achievements of Carter. He's a little more successful in foreign policy, and we'll take a look at that. So Jimmy Carter, just like in domestic policy, he wanted to be different than the presidents before him. And so he came into to the presidency with a philosophy on foreign policy. He wanted to focus on human rights. So he was not so much concerned with Cold War rivalries and things like that, but he wanted the United States to play a big role in protecting human rights around the world. So those are some of the things that he looked at as foreign policy leader. The picture of Carter that we were talking about a second ago, that was him negotiating the Camp David Accords. So as president, he negotiated a peace arrangement between Egypt and Israel, who had been at war before this. So here we see, this is a thing that presidents do a lot now. The president is not necessarily just negotiating treaties for the United States, but is often playing like referee in negotiations between two other countries. And so here, the Camp David Accords are a big, huge deal. He got a Nobel Prize for this because he got Egypt and Israel to meet and to work together on a treaty where both countries could have peace with each other as neighbors. And so this is an important step for the president because the president is taking a bigger role in playing like global referee here. Jimmy Carter also returned the Panama Canal to Panama. He thought that Panama should be the rightful owners of the Panama Canal. The United States built it in 1906. And the United States had owned and operated it for almost 80 years there. But Carter negotiated an agreement to return that to Panama so that the people of Panama could benefit from this thing that this important transportation center that is in Panama. So it should belong to the people of Panama. While Carter is in charge, there's a big revolution in Iran, and this becomes a big important American moment because the revolution changes the government in Iran, but the people who took over Iran also conquered the United States embassy, and they took many U.S. embassy workers hostage. And so this was a long crisis for the United States as many of our citizens were held hostage in Iran and Carter was unable to get them freed. And so this became a big problem, one of the main reasons that he lost the election in 1980. And then president for most of the 80s is Reagan. Reagan winning election in 1980. Reagan really the symbol of America in the 80s. Here he is making a speech at the Berlin Wall. Reagan very different than Carter, changes a lot of programs and things of Carter, but also a really important shift in American politics for a long time. Reagan is a very, very popular president and changed the way that government worked in America. Really has impacts until today. In domestic policies, one of Reagan's big things, Reagan wanted to shrink the size of the government. He believed in this economic theory called supply side economics. He thought that the most important goal of the government would be reducing taxes. So Reagan, as president, was in charge of several large tax cuts, especially tax cuts for wealthier taxpayers. He changed the way that taxes were paid, brought the tax rates way down. So the United States under President Reagan is bringing in way less money in taxes. This will be important in a minute, but this becomes like the main philosophy of the Republican Party after Reagan, because this is popular with voters. If they're paying less taxes, they're a little happier. And so supply side economics is a thing that we'll see again and again. They want to cut taxes to the wealthiest taxpayers because they think the wealthiest taxpayers, if they pay less taxes, will end up investing in new businesses and create opportunities and things like that. Earlier, we saw Nixon declare a war on cancer. Here, Reagan declares a war on drugs. So he uses this idea of war to be able to get the full strength of the United States government to enforce drug laws and to crack down on the drug problem in the United States. So this is a lot more enforcement and policing of communities where drugs were a big problem. So there's a lot more harsh punishments for people selling illegal drugs and possessing illegal drugs and all that. Now, this will be a problem that continues for many presidents and many different ways that presidents deal with this. Reagan is also behind the deregulation of many industries. So that means the removal of a lot of rules about how things are produced. So this is a Republican president, just a couple presidents after Nixon, who was putting in programs like the Environmental Protection Agency and stuff. Reagan starts to remove a lot of the laws that tell businesses how to operate and how to produce goods. So he wanted to cut taxes and he wanted to get rid of regulations so that businesses had a lot more freedom and a lot more money. So most of the presidents we were just talking about, they had been working to calm the Cold War down. Reagan took the opposite approach. Reagan in foreign policy wanted to escalate the Cold War again. He really wanted America to look very strong and America to restart an arms race with the Soviet Union. Earlier, we mentioned that Reagan was reducing the amount of money that the government brought in because he reduced the taxes so much, but he started spending way more money on the military. So there is this program to build more weapons for the United States, because if the United States was building more weapons, then the Soviet Union would have to compete and meet that. Reagan also had this program called the Strategic Defense Initiative. We'll end up talking about a lot later, but this was a program where there would be a system of satellites and weapons in space that would create a protective shield around the United States so that could not have been nuclear bombed. Now, this was wildly unsuccessful. It was America's citizens saw this as way too expensive and not technologically possible, but this was one of the big programs that Reagan tried to push. Reagan's doctrine, Reagan's philosophy of government was more aggressive with the Soviet Union. He wanted to actually push back against Soviet Union governments around the world. And then one of the great things Reagan did was he put pressure on the government of South Africa to end its system of apartheid, which was a system in the it had been there for a long time, but it was still there in the late 80s of official government segregation and different sets of rules for people of different races in South Africa. And so Reagan worked with a lot of the rest of the world to put pressure on South Africa to end these policies. All right, so those are the presidents of the 70s and 80s. A lot going on there, a lot of domestic and foreign policy achievements that are very important, a lot of new things that we see the presidents doing for the first time. We'll move on and we'll take a look at the presidents of the 90s and 2000s.